Michigan sent 2 Republican freshmen to Congress in the last election. We've spent some time with Lisa McClain from District 10. Let's spend some time this morning in District 3, the other side of the state, with Peter Meijer, who arrived at a historic moment in Washington and was getting national attention for breaking with most of his GOP colleagues on impeachment. Very good to have Congressman Peter Meijer with us today on Flashpoint. Congressman, happy Easter.
Happy Easter. Thank you for having me on.
You bet. I want to start with whether or not, given the three very turbulent months that have marked the start of your congressional tenure, have you had any misgivings or second thoughts? We've had all kinds of political calamity, of course, but then you've also got security problems. We just saw another one this past Friday. Have you had any misgivings about what you decided to take on?
Oh, none at all. I think there were some folks who got to D.C. and with the events that were unfolding in January said, you know, what the heck am I doing here? And there were others, and then I count myself in this group, who said, we feel that we're exactly where we need to be. And in my background's in the military, humanitarian aid, and disaster response. So having spent about 3 years between Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm no use to dicey situations. Definitely didn't hope to see that in Washington, but you know, it's times like those when you need to have, you know, calm heads that can prevail.
You also, though, arrive at a time when there is great upheaval within your party. You of course know you've already got opponents lining up, Republican opposition lining up for an election against you that's 2 years away. And I guess some see that there is a fight for the soul of the GOP right now. Kind of tell me a little bit about your thoughts about where the GOP is headed.
Obviously, for both the country and also the Republican Party in particular, we've been through a trying period of trying to just understand what it is the party stands for. Are we a party that is a party of ideas that is trying to be in a position to earn the trust of the public to be governing? Or are we one that, you know, feeds off of outrage and anger and focuses on emotion rather than on action, on performance rather than on getting things done? So I have obviously cast my lot in believing that the Republican Party could be one that can govern this country, that can lead forward with conservative principles and solutions to the problems that are facing our country today. But there's obviously a lot of folks who might beg to differ.
You, among your first 2 big votes to face you in Congress are the question of whether or not you want to sign 2 very big checks. Let's start with the coronavirus and pandemic relief bill, the stimulus bill, that I think to some people's way of thinking worked out perfect for the Republicans because they got to vote against it, and yet their constituents ended up getting the money because this bill was pretty popular with the American people, according to the polling.
Yeah, well, when the polling all says, do you like checks? People are going to say yes. Now, I was frustrated that the direct cash payments, which I strongly supported, were such a small fraction of this bill. I'm a member of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus group. It's 58 members, 29 Republicans, 29 Democrats. Yep. We had tried to rush through $160 billion for vaccines, testing, and PPE. And the Democratic majority wouldn't let us. We were trying to front load that. I offered a counter proposal that could have increased the checks by $1,000 to $2,400, maintained a lot of the same essential components, but still came in $1 trillion short. So at the end of the day, I mean, that was a sweetener on a package that was filled with things that had nothing to do with the pandemic. It was an appropriations omnibus package that was, you know, hidden under the guise of COVID relief and stimulus. And we're going to be paying for it for years to come. It's
been really interesting watching the debate over whether or not all of this was there too much waste in this that didn't have anything to do with the pandemic, because some would argue that it's really hard to point to any part of American life that hasn't been impacted by the pandemic.
Absolutely. You know, that was the justification some used for including, you know, bridge construction in northern New York State or infrastructure in the San Francisco Valley. You can make that excuse and rationalization for $83 billion to help bail out multi-state, multi-employer pension plans. But the reality is that none of those were directly tied. And especially when the rhetoric from the White House is we have to pass this package to reopen the schools, you know, holding our kids' education and future hostage in order to get what I would argue are, you know, I say unrelated. You can maybe make a very tenuous connection somehow, but certainly things that have nothing to do with addressing the emergency facing this country today, nothing to do with, very little to do with the vaccination program rollout that is essential, very little to do with supporting our small businesses so they can reopen. So much of this package was around multi-year appropriations, many of which didn't have any bearing on the actual crisis we're facing today.
Well, you paved the road there pretty well between the infrastructure components of that bill and the next package that I want to talk about, and that's President Biden's infrastructure plan. Bill Maher last week made what I thought was a pretty profound observation, that while China is building dams, we're arguing over who we should name them after. I think that we've all talked and given a lot of lip service to how America's infrastructure is falling apart, and yet when it comes time to pick up the tab for it, no one's really willing to do that. Give me your thoughts on this massive infrastructure plan.
Yeah, right now we're seeing a lot of very round numbers that I don't fully understand how they were arrived at. If you look back at the American Rescue Plan, the only reason why I can figure it was 1.9 trillion as opposed to 1.8 or 2.1 was because you could run right up to that number without saying it's trillions. It was just avoiding a plural. When it comes to the package that the Biden administration is proposing on infrastructure, again, it's 100 billion for this, 100 billion for that. I think we're spending more on electric vehicle subsidies than actually on highway and road improvements. I drive an electric vehicle. I like electric vehicles. But again, I want to actually be having these metrics be correlated to actual returns and outcomes. And you talk about China. I mean, one of the biggest differences between our investment in the US and other countries around the globe is they are killing us on getting things built quickly.
Yeah.
If you look at the cost per mile of the New York City subway, there's no reason why it should be 4 times Rome, London, Paris. I mean, every single thing we try to build is so beset by process permitting and other regulatory constraints that we never actually build what we're trying to do, and it takes decades to get something done that should only take a year or two.
It's fair to talk about the efficiency of the spending, but to say that we're going to fix America's infrastructure without a tax increase or without paying something more somewhere along the line seems foolish, doesn't it? I mean, if I own a car, even if I've paid it off, somewhere along the line, it's going to be time for a tune-up. It's going to be time for a new engine. There's a lot of upkeep that costs money.
Oh, absolutely, and that's why you should have user fees. Right. I mean, that's one of the things that I think we forget. And one of my deepest frustrations with how our government is financed is we kind of throw a bunch of money in and then draw a bunch of money out. What we're drawing out is invariably going to be more than what we're putting in, but very little of it's correlated to paying for the things that are being used on a daily basis. I mean, that's how you get an effective program, is the revenue that's generated goes towards paying off that investment. And that's where you actually can be connecting how something is performing. Now, one of the things that frustrated me about the plan, and again, we're just getting some vague details right now, a lot of that's going to get meted out in negotiations, but that there was a split between physical infrastructure and what they were loosely terming human infrastructure. To your point or to our earlier conversation on the American Rescue Plan, I mean, I guess you can start to stretch the word infrastructure beyond, things that we can touch, travel on, our rails, our roads, our bridges and tunnels, to encompass the most nebulous concepts. And at that point, I mean, are we even talking about infrastructure to begin with? And that's where just, again, these otherwise very palatable and politically popular things become distorted beyond any possible comprehension and just an excuse to ram through priorities that are entirely unrelated.
It's really interesting that Republicans are again finding their bearing around the national debt, which grew precipitously under President Trump, and we didn't hear as much talk about, for instance, tax cuts without attendant spending cuts. Before I let you go, I want to make sure that I also let you weigh in on Ron Weiser's comments this past week. We talked earlier in this half hour to Dana Nessel. He also mentioned you and Fred Upton in his screed against fellow Republicans in your case. What are your thoughts about his remarks and whether or not he should continue as the state chairman of the party?
Well, I certainly have been outspoken in my belief that we need to turn down the heat on our political rhetoric, that we need to be focusing on solutions and not just giving into this negative polarization that has really come to define both parties. You talk to many Democrats on why they're Democrats. It's not because they love the Democratic Party. It's because they're fearful of Republicans and Republican governance. And then the same thing about Republicans. I mean, we've become parties that are identified not by what we believe in, but by what we're viscerally opposed to. And I don't think that's how we're going to move forward as a country. I think if we're spinning in circles trying to criticize each other, we're not moving forward. And we're going to get left in the dust by the countries around the globe who are able to harness the collective energy of their people in a common direction. So I'm very supportive of what we can do, and this is what I try to exemplify in DC is I have no issue saying where I disagree with the Democrat, but that's going to be rooted around, my belief in what policy outcomes will actually achieve a better state for the American people, rather than personal attacks and trying to demonize.
Really good to have a conversation with you this morning, Congressman. I hope it's the first of many. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Deb.
Take care. We'll take a quick break. Back with more on Flashpoint right after this.